una sesión, por favor consulten estas hojitas que tenemos aquí. También quiero anunciar que la conferencia de Alfredo Bustos cambió de salón porque va a ser en un salón con computadoras. Entonces, si alguien va a ir a la conferencia sobre modelos markovianos, va a ser en el DPB 03, porque él nos pidió que quería trabajar con las computadoras. Entonces, ya con esto los dejo con Silvia Yorguli, que va a ser la moderadora de esta mesa y que ya todos conocen.
Bueno, buenos días. Me da mucho gusto poder participar como moderadora en esta... ¿Ya se oye mejor? Entonces, más bien es como lo... Bueno, primero, buenos días, bienvenidos a esta sesión plenaria sobre efectos de la reducción del tamaño de la familia en el bienestar. Esta sesión fue organizada conjuntamente por Julieta Pérez Amador, por mí, Julieta, ahora con su doble papel de comentarista también. Y bueno, nada más mencionar que esta sesión se pensó en el marco del título justamente de la Reunión Nacional de Demografía sobre la revisión de si la familia pequeña vive mejor. Y dentro del marco de esta y otras sesiones plenarias que hay sobre el tema de la familia, en esta en específico estamos orientados la sesión está pensada y estructurada para armar una reflexión en torno a las consecuencias y las implicaciones del cambio familiar en diferentes dimensiones y en diferentes espacios geográficos. Sin más preámbulo, daré la palabra a nuestro primer presentador, David Lam, de la Universidad de Michigan.
Muchas gracias, buenos días. Voy a presentar en inglés. Thanks very much to Carla for inviting me to the meeting. It's my first SOMEDE meeting, and I was very intrigued when she invited me about the theme of the meeting. This 40 years is does the small family live better? And she asked me to discuss the links between changing family size and changes in schooling. And that's what I'm going to try to do. So I'm going to look at these questions. How much has family size changed in the last 40 to 50 years in Mexico? I'm going to make some comparisons to other Latin American countries, and I'm going to show that the answer to that depends on what you mean by family size. The main goal is to look at how these changes related to changes in schooling outcomes. Along the way, I want to talk about how changes in family size of women are related to changes in family size of children, a topic I've been working on lately with Leticia Martoletto. And similarly, we've also been looking at how changes in family size are related to changes in cohort size during the demographic transition, and these are important parts of the story. So I'll begin with a graph of the total fertility rate for Mexico, which all of you will be familiar with. This is from the UN's estimates, very rapid decline beginning actually around the time of the family planning program of Echeverria in '74. This is what Brazil looks like. This is Colombia. This is the average for Latin America from the same data. And you may be familiar with the fact that Brazil actually had no family planning program. So these patterns look very similar in spite of very different policies. I'm not going to get into that, but it's just a background for these changes. So big declines in the total fertility rate across Latin America, Mexico slightly later, but very similar pace of decline. Now that's one way of thinking about family size, but of course the total fertility rate doesn't really measure the family size of anyone. It's a hypothetical construct. There's the fertility rate again. I want to compare it to some more direct measures of family size. This is the children ever born to women 45 to 49. I can only estimate that for the census years, and I'm using IPUM's international versions of the 70, 90, 2000, and 2010 census. So not surprisingly, it falls later because this, of course, is women who were already 45 to 49 in 1970 couldn't have been affected by the big fertility decline yet. This is the thing that I would argue is most directly relevant to schooling, or at least one way of doing it. It's a way that Letitia and I have done it a lot, is to look at the family size of children age 9 to 11. We use 9 to 11. We sort of want 10-year-olds. They're kind of the middle of the school age group. We use 9 to 11 to deal with age misreporting and smoothing and so on. So that's going to be one group I'm going to look at. So that yellow line is the family size of roughly 10-year-old children, and you can see that it declines quite steadily. Of course, we have to jump all the way from 70 to 90 because that's the two censuses, so we don't quite know exactly what happens in between, but quite large decline. So family size of 7 for 10-year-old children in 1970 down to 3.5 in 2010. Now I want to make some comments about that family size. So first, as you can see, what happens to family size depends on the measure, when the decline begins, how fast it begins, and so on. I like this family size of children 9 to 11 if you're thinking about how this is related to school-age children, so how many siblings are they competing with, if you want to think of it that way. You notice that in the graph, the family size of children 9 to 11 tracks fairly closely the family size of women age 45 to 49, they're completed children ever born. Is that surprising? The answer is yes. I was actually surprised to see that. It's kind of just a coincidence, actually. The family size of children is always larger than the family size of their potential mothers. This is a point made by Preston in a famous 1976 paper. Letitia and I have looked at it a lot. I'm going to say a little bit more about it. And of course, the women 45 to 49 are not really the mothers of the school-age children. They're really the children of a younger group of mothers. So I'm going to show you that if you take the women age 45 to 49 and you look at their children, this is done just by reweighting the distribution. So women who have 2 children get weighted twice, women who have 8 children get weighted 8 times. This is the children ever born to women 45 to 49, the same thing I just showed. This is the family size of their children. And you'll notice that the family size of the children is about 40% larger than the family size of women. We find this in many countries. In most Latin American countries, this would be, if you had to guess what's the family size of children, the mean family size of children, it's about 40% larger than the mean family size of women. Why is that? Well, one reason is because women who have 0 children are never counted in the family size of children. And more generally, you're just reweighting the distribution. So as I said, women who have 10 children, those children get counted 10 times when you do the family size from the child's perspective. So I'll say more about that in a second. So a decline in the family size of women does not necessarily imply a decline in the family size of children, or a decline at the same rate. It also doesn't imply a decline in cohort size. And both of these may be very important in thinking about what's happening to schooling, cohort size and the family size, from the children's perspective, not from the women's perspective. I don't have time to go in this in detail, but I just wanted to mention, and it's something that Letitia and I are working on a lot and have one paper and some more coming out, kind of revisiting this famous paper of Preston's about family size of children and family size of women. This is what the math looks like that Sam showed. We've rewritten it a little bit. Basically, the point is the family size of children, the mean family size of children of some group of women, say women 45 to 49, is equal to the mean family size of the women, I guess I don't have a pointer, the SW, times the term that's 1 plus the squared coefficient of variation. It depends on the dispersion in fertility. So if all women had exactly 3 children, all children would be from families of size 3. But if some have 0 and some have 1 and some have 9 and some have 10, the family size of children is always going to be larger than the family size of women. So we showed that, and Sam actually predicted that as fertility falls, the family size of children will fall more slowly than the family size of women because, in our restating of his point, the coefficient of variation of fertility goes up. Actually, fertility becomes very skewed as fertility declines. I'll show you that. So we showed that for many countries this is true. The family size of children falls more slowly than the family size of women. And this will hopefully be coming out in demography soon. You can read all about it. But here's the case of Mexico. So This is the distribution of the family size of women aged 45 to 49 in the 1970 census, a mean of 6.2. This is the distribution of the family size of children. And it's just a reweighted version of the other one. And it actually crosses at exactly the mean family size of women, which is a point that we derived that we think is interesting. And so the family size of children is always this shifted to the right version of the family size of women. This is what happens if you put them all together. So the blue ones are the family size of women, the yellow ones are the family size of children. And if you ask this question, does the family size of children fall more slowly than the family size of women in the case of Mexico? The answer is no. They fall at exactly the same rate. So what in almost every other country we've looked at turns out to be extremely interesting isn't so interesting in Mexico. But it's actually quite an important fact. So it's also important that this 40% difference between the family size of children and the family size of women that you get in Mexico, and you see in a lot of Latin American countries, is much larger than you see in other parts of the world, and it's because of the greater inequality. So if you looked in in African countries, it's only about 20% larger. Okay, now cohort size. So another point that we've made is that cohort size often increases at the same time that family size is falling during the demographic transition. The reason for this is, all demographers will understand, it's population inertia. Family size starts to fall, but there's all these women increasing in childbearing ages from past population growth. But we think it's something that has not been noticed enough, that actually through most of the recent decades, most countries that have been undergoing fertility decline had continuing rapid growth of the, say, the school-age population, which is what we're interested in. So this continuing increase in cohort size, this population momentum offsets the fertility decline for some time until it eventually, the fertility decline wins. Okay, so this is the case for Mexico. This is what the family size of children age 9 to 11 looks like, which I showed you. It's going down. This is what cohort size looks like. Cohort size measured in a way that's sort of relevant to them. It's the size of cohorts when they're 10 years old. Okay, so you can see that as growing very fast in the 70s, it sort of slows down a bit actually right about the time the fertility decline begins, and then it increases again. So for most of this last 40 years that we're interested in, the family size of school-age children was falling, but the cohort size of school-age children was increasing. So increasing pressure for spaces in school, but decreasing siblings to compete with. Okay, now I haven't said anything about schooling, so let's get to schooling. So what's happened to schooling? I'm going to show you some graphs of the percentage of cohorts that completed primary and secondary schooling. I'm going to show them timed around the time they were age 10. Okay, so, and all of this is based on data from the IPPMS International, and I meant to put in a plug. Bob McKay is here. He'll gladly give you one of these IPPMS mugs if he hasn't already given them all away. And he's going to give you a card that just coincidentally has exactly the graph I'm going to show you next, which I made before I came here, and then he was handing out these cards, and he has almost this exact same graph on his little card, showing that you can use the census data, of course, to look at the percentage of cohorts with primary, secondary schooling, et cetera. He shows it using all the different censuses. I'm just going to use the 2010 census. So this is the percentage of men with primary schooling, and again, this is looking at them at the year they were age 10. So roughly what was happening to schooling in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, if you want to think of it that way. This is men, this is women, so the gap between males and females has closed. I've been generating these graphs for all over the world. You see this sort of same pattern. Gender gap has either switched signs or closed almost everywhere, certainly in Latin America. This is the first cohort that would have been affected by the 1974 family planning policy. They were 10 in 1984. So you can see that there were very rapid increases in schooling long before the decline in fertility actually began. This was a period when 50s, 60s, 70s, fertility was still very high, hadn't really begun to fall at all. Also, if we compare it to cohort size, cohorts were growing very fast in that period. So this again is the number of 10-year-olds as a kind of a measure of the school-age population. And you can see that the number of 10-year-olds was growing over 3% per year. In some years, 4 or 5% per year growth in the number of 10-year-olds. at a time when most of the increase in primary schooling took place in Mexico, before the fertility decline, before cohorts ever stopped growing. Cohorts have subsequently stopped growing about the time of the fertility decline and then started to increase again. So the first answer to is decline in family size responsible for increases in schooling in Mexico? Well, certainly not completely. Most of the improvements in primary schooling took place before that even happened. And that's going to be important in terms of looking at fertility as well. This is secondary schooling. It's a little more interesting in the terms of the family change issue. So there's males, there's females. Again, females passing males, very rapid growth in secondary schooling. Again, much of that took place before the fertility decline, but some of it's continued since then. There's the cohort size again. So if you heard my PAA presidential address a few years ago, one of the many things I said was amazing about the last 50 years of rapid population growth around the world is these big increases in schooling in countries at times when their school-age populations were growing at historically unprecedented rates. We had the biggest improvement in schooling all around the world, and Mexico would be included there. Okay, but now this period since 1980 is kind of interesting because that's a period when we might say, well, the decline in family size could be a candidate for that, some of that increase since the 1980s and into the 90s. Okay. Now I want to say something about, okay, so how much of the increase in schooling can be linked to declines in fertility? So we saw that certainly there's this big period that seems to have nothing to do with declining fertility, big increases before fertility decline even began. I'm going to sort of start in the with 1970 and look at that period since then, when a lot of this had already happened. But there's still interesting changes since then. So I'm going to look at graphs of the relationship between family size and children's schooling from 1970 to 2010. I'm looking at 16 to 17-year-olds because I want kids who are old enough to have been through school a fair degree, but still live at home so I can link them to their mothers and look at children ever born of their mothers. Okay, so on the horizontal axis here is the number of children ever born to the woman, and the vertical axis is the mean years of schooling of their 16 to 17-year-old children. So it has a negative slope except for this little bit going from 1 to 2 children. Larger families had lower schooling of their kids, as we might expect. Now, the blue line is 1970, there's 1990, there's 2000, there's 2010. Now, the exercise I want to do is to just look at the mean. This point here is the mean children ever born and mean schooling. So in other words, those numbers mean that the mean children ever born was 7.9, and the mean schooling of their 16 to 17-year-old children was 4.7. If we jump over time, we end up at the upper left here at children ever born mean of 4.2 and a schooling of 9 years. So an increase of over 4 years in the schooling just of 16 to 17-year-olds, which is quite remarkable in a 40-year period. So the schooling of 16 to 17-year-olds almost doubles, and the family size almost falls by half. Now, an interesting question here is, the exercise I like to do is just say, well, suppose that you just moved along that blue curve in 1970. Suppose you just took the declining family size. How much would that have explained about the increasing schooling? So I basically, first let me show you, I don't really have time. I was going to show you that Mexico's done much better than Brazil. So Brazil, but the exact same picture. Brazil has lower schooling at every family size and has a much steeper gradient. But back to Mexico. Okay, so I'm just going to do this exercise. If you moved along the curve here and said, give everybody in 1970 smaller families and take the same relationship, how much schooling would schooling go up? The answer is a little less than 1 year, or about 20% of the total increase, or 80% of the increase is actually this upward shift of the curve. So in other words, one very simple way of saying how much of the increase in schooling is due to just holding the relationship between schooling and family size constant and decreasing family size, the answer is not a huge amount, about 20%. The rest is due to this big shifts, which is sort of increasing schooling at every family size, which is just increased investments in schooling and so on. Okay, I also want to point out that rising education that happened before fertility decline ever began is itself a good candidate for helping explain the fertility decline. Okay, So I said education was increasing for decades before fertility began. In some previous work with Suzanne Durier in Brazil, we showed that rising education of women could account for a lot of the fertility decline in Brazil. If you just said, take these old increases in schooling from previous decades, the women then arrived to childbearing age better educated, how much could that explain a fertility decline? The answer was about 2/3. I'm going to do the same thing here for Mexico. So I'm using women 30 to 49, which is a somewhat odd group to look at, but it's because they're basically the mothers of school-age children, and that's what I'm interested in. Okay, so there's what that graph looks like. So that's years of schooling of women on the horizontal axis and their mean number of children on the vertical axis. Not surprisingly, it has a big negative slope. That's in 1970, there's 90, there's 2000, there's 2010. So that's a very steep gradient. So the exercise we're going to do is move women along the increased schooling as actually happens. How much fertility decline can we explain? So I'm sort of doing the same thing I did before. So the mean number of, now we're going from left to right. In 1970, there was years of schooling of the women had a mean of only 2.8, and they were having 5.6 children. By 2010, the mean schooling has risen to 8.9, and fertility has fallen to 2.7, or the mean number of children of this group, 30 to 49. If we do the same decomposition, we explain 63% of the fertility decline by increased schooling, that is just shifting along the curve, leaving 27% unexplained. So why is this interesting? Because it says that the increased schooling itself is a very good candidate to explain the fertility decline, and that's also going to explain increased schooling of the children. So in my 1 minute left, I want to do this little exercise here. This is the increase in schooling of 16 to 17-year-olds over time. So everything's relative to 1970. So by 1990, schooling had gone up 3 years. By 2000, another 3.7 years, and by 2010, this 4.4 years that sorry, let me go back here, 4.4 years. So big increase in schooling just of 16 to 17-year-olds. What if we control for family size? Well, then it looks like that. So about one child less, 1 year of schooling less than we had before. If we control for mother's education, we actually explain even more. And if we control for both, we get this picture here. So to summarize at the bottom here, how much of the 1970 to 2010 increase do we explain by these things? Well, decreasing family size explains about a quarter, so kind of similar answer to I got before, about 20%, 24%. Increased schooling of the women coming from past increases in schooling explains 36%. You put them both together, about 54%. So in conclusion, are smaller families better educated? One way of smaller families living better. Well, declining family size is one factor explaining the increase in education in Mexico. But large increases in education took place before fertility ever declined. We've seen that. The rising education is itself important in explaining the fertility decline. So over 60% of the decline can be explained by increases in schooling that already happened before the family planning programs. I've argued that the shift toward smaller families with high investments in children is a very important part of economic development around the world, and I think the same could be said of Mexico. But the declines in family size in and of themselves probably only explain about 20% of the increase in education in Mexico between 1970 and 2010. So Carla, there's your answer, 20%. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, David. La siguiente presentación está a cargo de Jennifer Glick. Ella es directora del Centro de Estudios de Población en la Universidad Estatal de Arizona.
Lo siento, solo hablar en inglés también. So I will have to present my comments. I will have to present my comments all in English. I'm sorry. And I will try to speak slowly for the translator. So I was invited to speak about Mexican families in the United States And as a demographer, I have to think about the unit of analysis for those families. And so I'm going to talk today mostly about from the perspective of Mexican origin children living in the United States and changes over time in their families, their socioeconomic status, and some of the divergence and variation within the Mexican origin child population in the United States that is brought about by changes in migration and also by population momentum, particularly the importance of the second generation when we're thinking about children specifically. So for my comments today, I'm going to start by talking about the size and the significance of the Mexican origin child population in the United States, some of the family and household composition patterns, also by generation status, socioeconomic status of these households, and how that is very important for understanding diversity within the Mexican origin population in the United States, and then some implications for well-being, for how children are doing. I will also use schooling as my outcome for thinking about how well children are doing. So just thinking about the significance of this population, why is it so important? Why in the United States do we need to pay very much attention? You all know the answer to this, but not everybody does. Not everybody understands. First of all, the change in the United States in the child population is very much driven by immigration. So we often compare across groups, and we talk about children of all immigrants, regardless of the national origin of their families. The entire growth of the child population, here you're just looking at 2000 to 2008, but the entire growth of the child population is completely due to children of immigrants. This is a huge second generation, meaning the US-born children of immigrant parents in the United States. It's very significant. It's a very important group to be looking at overall. And for the Mexican origin population in the United States, has a very long history. Been in the United States forever. But when we think about the significance of that for Mexican origin children today, they make up a large portion of all children of immigrants. So in this case, they make up about a third of all children who are born outside the United States and are living in the United States. They make up about just over 40% of all children in the second generation, meaning children born to parents born outside the United States, and then a much smaller portion, of course, of children in the third and higher generation. This is coming from the American Community Survey data for 2006 to 2010, so it's all children under the age of 18. If I just used the Mexican origin population or children of Mexican origin as the denominator, it would still come out to be about half of all children of Mexican origin in the second generation, so meaning they have immigrant parents. This is a very important demographic then for thinking about what's going to happen for families, for socioeconomic mobility in the United States going forward. The other important thing for thinking about the implications for children of immigrants and their impact on society overall, here we're just looking at 2010, but you can see the age distribution of the US-born children of Mexican origin in the United States, and they're largely a school-age population. So this is why there's so much discussion surrounding schooling, surrounding educational attainment, and often it's in comparison to other national origin groups in the United States, but I'm going to try to show you today how much diversity there is even just within the Mexican origin child population. So what are the changes, some of the changes in family and household composition over time? First of all, as we've seen, there's been significant declines in fertility, both in Mexico and in the United States. And so the experience of children of Mexican origin in the United States is that of living with fewer siblings in the household, not surprisingly. And if I took this back out to 1970, as David also did, you'd see an even more dramatic decline. So fewer children living with four or more siblings in the household, and more children living with no siblings or just one sibling. Some of this, of course, is related to the age composition of the child population, but there's been that steady decline in fertility for Mexican origin, both for immigrant women, but also for Mexican American women as well. But because we have this big change in immigration, this big population momentum in the second generation, there's a higher percentage of US-born children of Mexican origin living in what we call mixed nativity households, right? So living in a household with a Mexican-born adult or a Mexican-born child in the household. And this is coming from the census data, so I also should shout out for IPUM's data as well, but also the American Community Survey data for that 2010 period. So I'm combining 5 years of data from the survey to give us a 2010 estimate. But regardless, we would see an increase in mixed nativity households. So the big distinction for Mexican origin compared to other groups in the United States is this proximity to the migration experience. So migration being a very important influence on children's outcomes and associated with their well-being going forward as well. When we look at the household composition and the living arrangements of children, overall the trend in the United States is for fewer children to be living with a married couple, to be living with married parents. We see that trend for the Mexican American and Mexican origin population as well. Here I've also broken it out for you by generation status, and you can see that the second generation children of U.S.-born children of Mexican immigrants are more likely to live with, they live in a married couple household. But I'm going to show you that there's a lot of diversity in that second generation. So that second generation, because they're also more likely to live with other immigrants, and I'm going to show you for their foreign-born siblings, then you see this split in the second generation. So thinking about what's going to happen going forward, there's a lot of diversity just within that group as well. So one of the things, of course, we want to think about when we're talking about children's well-being going forward or the trends from the past is to think about the socioeconomic status of those families and households. There are some competing expectations in the literature in the United States when we talk about what happens over generation status across time in families to socioeconomic mobility. Oh, sorry. How do I go backwards? I did it. Sorry. I was going to go back one more. I lost my expectations, but they're gone. Okay, so I will tell you what the expectations are. So there are competing expectations in the literature for what will happen across generations. On the one hand, we use the sociological literature of assimilation or adaptation. We think, oh, well, we will see a straight line from the first generation to the second generation to the third generation to the fourth generation, right? Mobility improves, life gets better for everyone. But then there's also a lot of concern that there's blocked mobility. There's something that impedes or prevents people from being able to achieve socioeconomic mobility going forward across generations. And so we have a lot of debate in the literature about what's going to happen to the second generation, and particularly what's going to happen across different groups in the United States. So when we think about the socioeconomic well-being of children living in the United States, children of Mexican origin, this is the poverty status, right? So it's just the household is at or below the poverty line. And we see that for first-generation children, so, or you might think of these as 1.5 generation children, right? So these are children born in Mexico but living in the United States. That poverty, likelihood of living in a household below the poverty line is much higher. There's been some decline from 1990 to 2000. Actually, there's a decline from 1980 to 1990, and then, but for ease, I just chopped it off for 1990. And you see that decline, a little bit of an increase by 2010 for all the generation groups. But when we look at the progress or the differences across the generation, it looks linear. It looks like things get better across the generation status. Another way of thinking about the socioeconomic status of children in the households, think about what human capital is present in those households. These is the proportion of children living in households with no adult who has finished high school, right? So overall, the level of human capital of all adults in the household is fairly low. And we see improvements in that, again, over time. So so the lower the bar, the better, right? Good. Low bar is better. So we see some improvements in that over time, but still this generational pattern. But the second generation looks pretty high, right? Looks like those bars are much closer to the first generation. It's because of those mixed nativity households, right? So they're all living in the same household. The 1.5 generation living with the second generation as well. Finally, we think about the prospects for the future for children based on, say, the ability of the household and adults in the household to interact in the society in which they are currently living. So in this case, I'm using a very crude measure. We call it, according to the US Census, linguistic isolation. Very crude measure, but that's what they call it. It's simply the households in which no adult, or no one over the age of 14, so adolescents and adults speak English well or very well. So they're reporting this for themselves, right? How well do you speak English? And not surprisingly, we do see a lot of variation by the third and higher generation, because the United States is the graveyard of languages. There is no one, there are no children who are in a household where no one is speaking English. But we see a much higher bar for the second generation than we might expect if we were looking forward. And when scholars compare across groups, they often point to this. They say, oh, the second generation for Mexican doesn't look as good as the second generation for other groups. But this is because of this mixed nativity and proximity to the migration experience and the population momentum within the second generation. So what I want to argue is that there are many sources of variation within the second generation. And one of the very important ones is important for demographers to think about what will happen in the United States in the next generation, or even thinking now about the increase in return migration to Mexico, is to think about who's returning, the selectivity of return, and what the second generation will look like going forward, but also thinking about what the new third generation will look like, right? The children of the second generation, what will their mobility look like? One of the things to think about is when the parents came. And often we think about the duration, how long they live in the United States. But I don't think that's the way to think about it. I think we want to think about when in the family life course, when in the life course of the parent did they arrive. If the parent is 1.5 generation, then I think we have to think about the second generation very differently. And so if we talk about the experience of being in those mixed nativity households, you see if the mother or I'll stick to mothers for now. If the mother arrived after the age of 18, so she was an adult migrant, she's a first generation migrant, then the second generation child is much more likely to live with a first generation child, a 1.5 generation child, right? So they'll have a sibling who was born in Mexico. They're much less likely if the mother is herself a 1.5 generation child. Right? So if she arrived as a child, then all of her children are born in the United States. Those US-born children are living in households only with other US-born children. That has implications for the socioeconomic status of those families and households. So here we're looking at the same socioeconomic indicators, but now I'm only looking at the second generation, and I'm going to divide it by when the mother arrived in the United States, right? How old was she when she came? And again, this is selective because these are only mothers then who stayed in the United States, right? So if the mother arrived after the age of 18, so she's the green bar, then poverty is much higher, right? It's much more likely to be in poverty. So this is what pulls the whole second generation bar closer to the first generation bar when we're looking at the perspective of children. Lower for children whose mothers arrived before age 18. The same thing for the education status. So this again was households where no one has completed high school, or adults have not completed high school. And again, for the linguistically isolated households, even a bigger difference. So if the mother herself arrived as a child, it's much more likely that she's speaking English or reports that she speaks English well or very well. And so the child is much less likely to live in those linguistically isolated households. It's a bad term. I don't like the term, but I use it because the census used it. Okay, so what does that mean for children's well-being? And I don't want to take up too much time, but I'm going to present very simple predictions. In this case, I'm going to just predict the child's on-time school enrollment. So with census data and with the American Community Survey, I'm somewhat limited in the educational outcomes I can look at, and I did not bring my longitudinal data, good education data in the United States, so I'm just going to present with the American Community Survey. So it's just, are they in school, and roughly in school the right grade for their age? So on-time schooling. Oh, perfect. So to do this, I want to control for the generation status, including that parental age at migration. So I'm going to look at the generation status of the child. So the child is 1.5 generation. The child is second generation, but has a mother who is 1.5 generation. The child is second generation, but the mother is first generation. It's too many generations. Or third and higher generation. I wish I could tell you what happens to the only third generation, right? I wish I could pull out the grandchildren of the immigrants, because that would give us a better idea of how linear this is when we look at the third generation. But I cannot do that for you today. I'm going to control and adjust the logistic regression models here for family and socioeconomic status. So those same variables you saw, the household composition, living with a married couple, living in poverty, living in a household with low levels of education overall, and also the linguistic isolation. So I'm going to control for all of that and see if we still see variation within the second generation. I'm also going to show you the predictions by age. So we want to do interactions by age because we have concerns not only about the length of time it takes for children to become enrolled in school. Do they enroll in school very early or late? And then also how the rate at which they leave school, right? So are they dropping out of school? Now for some of the 1.5 generation children, some of them will have never enrolled in school in the United States. So they're not necessarily what we call dropouts, right? If they arrive in the United States as adolescents, 16, 17 years old, they are still in the data, and I cannot tell if they never enrolled in school in the United States. So they're not enrolled, so they look like dropouts, but they're not necessarily dropouts. So keep that in mind when we look at the first generation. Okay, so I'll show you the predicted models. I'm not going to show you the equation. I won't show you all the numbers. I'll just show you what we get when we look at the predicted values. And what we see is a very consistent pattern by age, which we would expect. We have very, very high school enrollment in the United States, particularly at younger school ages. Compulsory education is supposed to be until age 16 or so. So very high school enrollment. The gray bar is the lower line. Those are those first generation children. So even if we're talking about, if we don't look at the 16 or 17-year-olds, right? Even if you take them out because you think they never enrolled in school in the United States, their school enrollment is still significantly lower than the children born in the United States. So they're coming to the United States, they're living in the United States, but they're not enrolled in school or they're not on time. And some of these children are retained in school. They repeat grades. But I gave this a pretty big window, so I let them be on time even if they're within a couple years of what I might expect for their grade, to try to adjust for that. The second generation and third generation, much less variation, right? So once we control for family socioeconomic status and all those other characteristics, we lose all of the differences, or most of the differences, except for the oldest ages. So I would draw your attention to the older adolescents and the second generation. So that interaction with the mother's age at arrival and age is significant there. So the second generation whose mothers arrived before the age of 18, so the children of the 1.5 generation, have higher school enrollment. They look like they're doing a little better. So just to conclude, I lost my, I'm not done. I'm going to conclude anyway. But I will have to read my concluding thoughts because now I can't see them. So something happened to my slides, I'm sorry. So my concluding thoughts. So the Mexican origin population is obviously, in the United States, is obviously very large. It's an important part of the population, and it's going to continue to grow regardless of what happens to continued migration, right? Regardless of whether we stay at low net migration or it rebounds following economic recovery, should that happen. This is a large and significant part of the population. This second generation is very large, right? So this cohort is very significant, and it has important implications for what's going to happen for the new third generation and for schooling in the United States going forward. We care about this for political reasons, for how voting is going to happen. We care about this for educational attainment and labor force. This is a significant portion of our labor force going forward. So this is an important group. The well-being then of the second generation is of great concern, and their socioeconomic mobility is critical, but there's a lot of diversity within the second generation. So we can't just assume that it's going to be linear change from the first, second to the third generation. I think this is very important, and I will just give you my little policy concern here for the 1.5 generation, because we know that there are many children who are brought to the United States who face barriers to their own socioeconomic mobility, either because of documented status or lack of documented status, but also due to the lower socioeconomic status of their households. They will be the parents of the new second generation. And so if their mobility is blocked, either, again, for policy reasons or for other reasons, then we will have difficulty seeing socioeconomic mobility and having new second-generation adults coming into the labor force and being able to compete and provide resources going forward into the future. So I think that second generation is very important, and I think paying attention to the family composition and the timing of migration within that family life course explains a lot of the variation we observe within the second generation. Thank you very much.
Bueno, me alegra que Jennifer haya cerrado con el tema de política pública, porque bueno, una de las reflexiones que queríamos motivar en esta mesa era justamente también vinculado con el tema de política pública, y la última presentación nos trae justo a ese tema de cambios en la dinámica familiar, en trabajo y en política pública. Entonces, le doy la palabra ahora a Orlandina de Oliveira, profesora del Colegio de México.
¿Dónde estará? ¿Dónde está? Ahí. Ponga ahí para mí. Sí, muy bien. Las reflexiones que vamos apresentar agora é parte de trabalho que realizamos conjuntamente com Brígida Garcia, e nossa preocupação era saber em que medida as políticas públicas levadas a cabo em México estavam respondendo ou não a las nuevas necesidades generadas por los cambios familiares, ou em que medida essas políticas estavam propiciando cambios familiares. Então, nós nos perguntávamos qual era a implicação de algumas políticas para entender su impacto sobre o bem-estar das famílias e principalmente em termos de las condições de homens e mulheres dentro de los hogares. Para reflexionar sobre esses aspectos, nós tuvimos primeiro que fazer uma revisão e uma sistematização das investigações que nos permitira ver que tipo de cambios familiares estavam ocorrendo no país, e depois revisar avaliações hechas sobre diferentes políticas para depois podermos perguntar-nos quais haviam sido os encontros e desencontros entre cambios familiares e políticas públicas, que tensões se generaram e que desfaces poderíamos encontrar. Vamos a tratar, então, inicialmente de alguns cambios básicos em termos de tamanho, composição e refatura de famílias. Depois passaremos a falar de los rasgos da dinâmica familiar. Nesse caso, é muito mais difícil realmente estabelecer cambios ao longo de largo período, por falta de fontes de informação comparáveis. E o central vai ser pensar acerca de qual o alcance das políticas públicas frente às principais transformações da família. Nós hoje falamos de políticas públicas e não de políticas de família, porque existe todo um debate em América Latina acerca de em que medida se pode falar de que existem em nossos países realmente políticas de famílias, ou se são medidas dispersas, ou em que medida existem políticas específicas de família. Aqueles interessados podem recorrer aos trabalhos de Irma Reagada e de Ana Maria Goldani, que tratam essa questão. E vamos a centrar, elegimos, ou seja, dada a dispersão do campo, elegimos 4 tipos de políticas, onde pensamos que poderíamos reflexionar acerca de seu impacto e sua relação com o câmbio familiar. Então, nós vamos referir muito brevemente às políticas de controle da natalidade, ao de combate à pobreza, conciliação família e trabalho e violência intrafamiliar. Em termos de transformações familiares, ou seja, os análises de Charre e Paz Lopes han sido para nós de grande utilidade, porque eles compararam as fontes comparáveis de 1970 e 2010, e UNO registra câmbios importantes em diferentes aspectos, tanto em termos de tamanho, em termos de composição. Os câmbios em composição são muito importantes, ao passar de 80% de hogares nucleares a cerca de 64%, pero também os unipersonais, casos que dobraram sua importância, os extensos também aumentaram em forma importante, assim como os hogares com refaturas femininas. Então, em termos de câmbios em tamanho e composição, essas são as cifras que temos que denotam que sim han havido câmbios importantes. Quando passamos à questão da dinâmica familiar, nossas análises, nossas investigações nos han levado a privilegiar basicamente duas dimensões. Uma dimensão que tem que ver com a divisão de trabalho entre homens e mulheres e outra que tem que ver com as formas de convivência familiar. Primeiro, vamos falar da divisão de trabalho entre mulheres. Nesse sentido, é importante ver que ha passado com a participação econômica feminina, com a participação de varones em los trabalhos domésticos de cuidado e de la sobrecarga de trabalho feminino. Aqui temos, em termos de trabalho feminino, há toda uma tradição de investigação de vários autores que nos permite delinear claramente os câmbios. Indiscutivelmente, a participação econômica feminina aumentou em forma fundamental nesses 40 anos que são analisados. Agora bem, esse é um aumento importante, mas há que ter presente que México, a participação econômica da mulher em México está muito por debaixo do promédio de América Latina, que está superior aos 50%, cerca de 53%. Também se ha encontrado em los análises que as esposas sempre têm menor nível de atividade em la participação em la atividade econômica comparativamente com as jefas, hijas ou outras parentes. Mas aquilo importante, como han destacado Pacheco e Garcia em seus trabalhos sobre as esposas, é que elas han aumentado nas últimas 2 décadas em forma muito importante sua participação, passando de 28% a 45%. Muito bem, que consequências ha tenido isso, ou seja, esse câmbio na participação sobre as famílias? Então, é clara a perda de importância do modelo clássico do jefe provedor e a mulher dedicada aos trabalhos reprodutivos. E também é importante destacar que há estudos que mostram que o trabalho da mulher ha tenido uma contribuição muito importante para manter muitas famílias por cima dos níveis de pobreza. Ou seja, em outras palavras, se as mulheres não trabalharam, os hogares seriam mais pobres. Em termos de trabalho doméstico e de cuidado, aqui temos também encuestas que se han hecho em el país em diferentes momentos que han permitido tratar de evaluar e medir e quantificar se ha havido câmbios importantes. O que nós outros constatamos, analisando, é que os câmbios em relação à participação de los varones em los trabalhos domésticos de cuidado han sido realmente limitados e que persiste a sobrecarga de trabalho doméstico e extradoméstico das mulheres em comparação com os homens em por lo menos de 15 horas em promédio da semana. Esses são resultados últimos que estão presentes em um livro que está editando Garcia e Pacheco sobre o uso do tempo. Também neste livro han encontrado que ha havido câmbios, aunque incipientes, no papel mais ativo de los padres em cuidar de los hijos. Isso já havia sido encontrado por Olga Rojas em estudos qualitativos e agora isso é reafirmado e confirmado em análise de encuestas representativas. Ou seja, se ha encontrado que sim, que os homens começam a participar em maior medida em trabalhos reprodutivos, pero são aqueles menores de 40 anos e os com maiores níveis de escolaridade. Algo muito importante, muito interessante que ha encontrado em seu trabalho Landi Sanches é que a brecha de gênero em quanto à realização do trabalho doméstico é menor em las parejas de doble ingresso. Isso eu creio que não havia sido analisado assim de maneira tão sistemática para o caso de México. Agora bem, passamos ao campo das formas de convivência familiar. Aqui há muito menos disponibilidade de informação é muito mais difícil estabelecer cambios a lo largo del tiempo. Entonces, o que nosotros hacemos é constatar que situação se ha dado em diferentes períodos analisados em um corte transversal. Ao falar de formas de convivência, nós outras, Brígida e eu, em nosso trabalho, sempre hemos privilegiado a participação das mulheres na toma de decisão, as formas de controle de las mulheres por los varones, por los cônjuges, porque elas têm que pedir permisso para realizar diferentes tipos de atividade, ou seja, se vê coartada a sua liberdade de movimento, e também aspectos vinculados com a violência doméstica. Em termos de tomas de decisão, os trabalhos, tanto os nossos como de Irene Cacique, e anteriormente, há muitos anos, de Teresita de Barbieri, já mostravam esta diferenciação entre espaços de decisão masculinos e femininos. Ou seja, os homens muito mais vinculados a decisões importantes de compras de bens, de onde viver, de onde mudar-se, a esfera do ócio, e as mulheres muito mais vinculadas aos roles de esposa e madres, como compra de alimentos, enfermidade de los hijos. Algo que ha cambiado, e isso pode dever-se a las políticas de planificação familiar e a todos os estudos de saúde reprodutiva, etc., é que sim se ha encontrado que as decisões sobre reprodução, sexualidade, criança de los hijos, por lo general, em algum setor social, se toma em forma conjunta entre ambos cônjuges. Em cerca de liberdade de movimentos, indiscutivelmente, essa é uma forma de controle masculino sobre as mulheres, e aqui os estudos a nível nacional, por exemplo, Irene Cacique ha hecho estimações, e muitas são as mulheres que têm que pedir permisso para realizar algum tipo de atividade. Ou seja, são mulheres que trabalham, a cifra varia entre 50% e 60%. Se são mulheres que não trabalham, a cifra sube a mais de 70%. ¿Sí? Brígida e eu, em nossos trabalhos sobre México e Monterrey, a fines de los anos 90, nós encontramos que ao redor de 25% das mulheres pedia permisso para trabalhar, 23% para associar-se e 18% para visitar amigos e parentes. Pongan atenção que estamos falando de México e Monterrey, ou seja, são grandes metrópoles neste país. Acerca da violência doméstica, aqui sim, se ha havido muito ênfase em la produção de informação e em la recoleção, aplicação de encuestas para medir a violência. Infelizmente, apresentam problemas de comparação e dificultam realmente medir se os níveis de violência intrafamiliar han aumentado ou não. O que se pode dizer é que a violência mais frequente em México é a emocional, seguida por a econômica, a física e a sexual. O que se podem os dados de diferentes períodos, 2003, 2009, creio 2011, é ver quais são as mulheres que estão mais expostas à violência. Ou seja, Irene Cacique e Roberto Castro han trabalhado muito com isso, manejando as encuestas, e han encontrado que as mais expostas à violência são as jovens, as economicamente ativas, as que experimentaram, elas ou sua pareja, violências em la niñez, e as com parejas que castigam a seus filhos. ¿Sí? Entre esses elementos, esses fatores de risco, por assim dizer, há muito interesse em ahondar em el papel do trabalho sobre a violência, porque vários estudos han encontrado e han afirmado que a mulher que trabalha está mais exposta à violência intrafamiliar por parte dos cônjuges que as que não lo hacen. Também essas encuestas han permitido ver que fatores uno podia pensar que atuam como proteção das mulheres contra algum tipo de violência. Então, aqui é a maior autonomia e empoderamento da mulher e também a possibilidade da mulher de controlar mais recursos. E aqui é interessante que são aquelas mulheres que os cônjuges trabalham maiormente em realização do trabalho doméstico. Isso que mostra é que as dimensões da dinâmica familiar estão relacionadas. Ou seja, o que ocorre com a divisão sexual de trabalho entre homens e mulheres também afeta as formas de convivência e também afeta as maior ou menor probabilidade de ocorrência de violência. Agora vamos ao tema. Muito bem. Frente a este marco de transformações, nós nos perguntávamos se a elaboração de políticas ha buscado ou não solucionar, apalear los problemas generados por los cambios. Y por otro lado, nos preguntamos qué políticas ante